The second week of April brought freezing temperatures, snow, and wind across parts of the high plains. According to Berger, a Nebraska Extension educator, cold and wet spring weather conditions can have impacts on livestock by increasing the possibility of hypothermia. In addition, Aaron explains how producers may have to delay pasture turnouts due to the fewer growing degree days recorded this year. We spoke with Aaron Wednesday morning and began by asking him how the April blizzard will affect cow-calf production.
So storms like we had with the blizzard last week are certainly a challenge for livestock producers, specifically thinking about cow-calf producers right now who would be calving. Those kind of wet, cold conditions are really challenging, especially for a newborn calf. So for cattle producers, protection obviously is pretty important around calving cows, providing wind protection for the cows in general, and trying to get those cattle as much as they can out of the weather, or at least mitigate some of the effects of the weather is pretty important with a storm like that.
Let's talk more about some of those steps that livestock producers can take to prepare for some of this adverse weather.
So obviously conditions like this, we do have the benefit in the time we live to have some warning that these kind of events are coming. So getting cattle closer to protection, providing them some high quality forage or feed prior to the storm, having some auxiliary power in place, especially for water sources for cattle that are in pens, is going to be important if we are without power for a few days. So those are some things that we can do to prepare. Again, getting those cattle in behind wind protection, especially with a blizzard type event, can really be helpful to keep those cattle from drifting and having them in a place where we can get to them and get feed to them with those kind of weather events.
Specifically for forages and perennials, how does this late snow affect them?
So really the cold temperatures are going to provide some challenges for us a little bit as we go into the spring. I was visiting with Dr. Jerry Valesky, who's at the West Central Research and Extension Center earlier this week. He told me that as of April 15th, they've been tracking growing degree days. They're in the low 60s in terms of percent of growing degree days as compared to the long-term average. So that's going to provide some challenges for folks who've been depending on winter annuals, also planting some spring annuals for forage. I think it's also going to probably challenge us a little bit in that we may need to plan for some delayed turnout on some things like smooth brome and perennial native range pastures that are predominantly cool season. Just because of the cool temperatures, we're not going to see as much forage production from those based on a traditional calendar date as we normally would.
Aaron, you noted that it could be important to supply mineral this time of year before and after letting them out on some of those forages and perennials.
So as we think about these cool season annual forages and also perennial forages, cool, cloudy, damp conditions can trigger an event called grass tetany, especially in cattle that are lactating. And so providing mineral that's got adequate magnesium as well as calcium as we turn out on these pastures is important. Would like to see that being supplied approximately 30 to 45 days ahead of time. We also may need to provide some additional hay out on some of these cool season annuals or even some perennial pastures, just because we're going to have some high quality there, but we're not going to have very much quantity. And so providing some additional energy may be important as we put cattle out on pasture this spring.
These weather events can cause some stress on livestock as well. Talk about the different kinds of stress and how you can adjust for that.
So I think we need to understand that when we have a spring wet storm like this, we actually can have more hypothermia exposure than we would if we think about a January day when it's 10 degrees outside. For cattle that have a winter hair coat, if it's cold and dry, their normal critical body temperature, the point at which they really need to start using energy to maintain their body temperature, is around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. However, when they're wet, like a condition we had last week, that lower critical temperature becomes closer to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So we actually can have more cold stress from an event in a blizzard like we had last week, where we had rain followed by snow. Those wet conditions with wind can really provide a lot of stress, cold stress, to that animal, which is something we don't normally think about with a spring storm, but certainly is a situation we need to be aware of. So minimizing wind chill effect, especially in a spring storm like that, can really help to minimize stress on cattle.
On the eastern side of the state of Nebraska, we're seeing some of the pastures begin to green up. Give us an update on the western side, what you're seeing in your pastures.
So on the west side, we're starting to see a tinge of green, but I would say we're behind maybe average in terms of what we would normally see. We've seen some really cool temperatures, and so while we're starting to get a tinge of color, we're really not growing much, and I think that's probably pretty much true across the state. So planning on some delayed turnout, I think, is really going to probably need to be something that people think through. Normal turnout date is probably not going to have adequate forage available for cattle to graze in many parts of the state this spring.